Earlier this year, I visited Egypt to see some of its most stunning ancient sites up close, looking at individual hieroglyphs and the amazing information they have revealed about this land's distant past.
In 2021, a team of archaeologists descended on ropes into a cave with an 80-meter drop in the Judean desert and found fragments of text that had been sitting untouched for nearly 2,000 years. When those fragments were run through AI analysis, what came back was not a confirmation of what scholars had assumed about the Dead Sea Scrolls for 7 decades. It was something considerably more complicated and considerably more human. The cave. The cave does not have an official name that most people would recognize. Instead, it has a nickname. Archaeologists and locals in the region call it the Cave of Horror, and the name is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is a direct description of what the cave contains and the tragedy that unfolded inside it. Around 135 CE, during the Bar Kokhba revolt against Roman rule, approximately 40 Jewish men, women, and children fled into this cave in the remote Judean desert as Roman forces advanced through the region. The cave was accessible only by a rope descent of about 80 meters, making it a natural fortress. Its hidden location and difficult entrance offered protection from soldiers searching the area, but the same features that made it a refuge also turned it into a prison. The Romans did not need to enter the cave to defeat those hiding inside. They simply surrounded the entrance and waited. With no escape route, no supplies, and no way to break through the siege, the people trapped inside slowly died from starvation and thirst. Their remains stayed there for nearly 2,000 years, preserved in the darkness of the cave. The cave was first explored in the 1960s as part of the wider search for Dead Sea Scroll material that began after the famous discoveries of the late 1940s. Archaeologists recovered ancient fragments, documented the site, and studied the materials they found. The cave became a known location, and many believed that anything important had already been removed. Decades later, the situation changed. In 2021, the Israel Antiquities Authority returned with advanced technology and a new reason for urgency. The threat was not just scientific curiosity, but the growing destruction caused by illegal artifact hunting. Looters equipped with modern tools had been targeting ancient sites, including places that archaeologists had already investigated. If anything valuable remained in the Cave of Horror, researchers feared it could disappear into the underground market before it was properly recorded. The excavation team descended into the cave using ropes and carried specialized scanning equipment, conservation materials, and a determination to preserve whatever history remained. They entered a place where dozens of people had hidden from an army nearly 2,000 years earlier, waiting for rescue that never arrived. Among the layers of dust, rock, and forgotten belongings, the archaeologists discovered that the cave still had secrets. What they uncovered was not an empty chamber left behind by time, but a collection of artifacts that revealed more about the people who lived, fought, and died during one of the most dramatic periods of ancient Jewish history. What the 2021 team found. The fragments recovered from the 2021 expedition were small, brittle, crushed in places by 2,000 years of rock movement and temperature change. When they were brought out of the cave and laid out for examination, they did not look like the key to anything. They looked like the remains of something that had barely survived. Reassembling them was the work of months. The team describes the process as similar to piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, where most of the pieces are missing. The remaining pieces have been partially destroyed, and you do not know in advance what the finished picture is supposed to look like. Working under magnification, with careful lighting and detailed photography at every stage, researchers began matching edges and textures and ink patterns across dozens of tiny pieces. The fragments turned out to be parts of what scholars call the Scroll of the 12, a collection of texts from the minor prophets, the shorter prophetic books in the Hebrew Scriptures. The specific passages that could be identified corresponded to sections of the books of Nahum and Zechariah, texts dealing with divine judgment and moral instruction for communities trying to rebuild after disaster. The content was significant. The language was the first significant surprise. The fragments were written in Greek, not Hebrew, not Aramaic, the spoken language of Jewish communities in that period. Greek, which was the language of the wider Mediterranean world, the language of commerce and administration across the Roman Empire, and the language of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that had been widely used in Jewish communities outside Palestine since the 3rd century BCE. This was not impossible or without precedent, but it changed the picture of who had made these scrolls and why, in ways that the AI analysis would make considerably clearer. The 2021 expedition also found other things that had nothing to do with texts. In a different section of the cave, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a child between 6 and 12 years old, mummified by the cave's dry conditions and carefully arranged in a fetal position. The burial was deliberate. Someone had taken the time and care to position this child with intention, even in a situation of extreme crisis, even in a cave where they were slowly dying. The burial predated the Bar Kokhba period significantly, dating back roughly 6,000 years, but its presence in the same cave layered another dimension onto what the space represented. Also found, a woven basket, large, perfectly intact, dating to approximately 9,000 years ago, from the Neolithic period when human communities were making the transition from following animal herds to staying in one place and growing food. The basket is one of the oldest preserved woven objects ever recovered. It sat in the dry dark of that cave for 9,000 years, without falling apart. 3 things from 3 vastly different periods of human history, all in the same cave, all preserved by the same combination of desert dryness and geological luck. The fragments from the 2nd century CE, a carefully buried child from 6,000 years ago, a basket from the earliest days of human settlement 9,000 years before that. The cave was not just a hiding place, it was a record. How AI read what humans couldn't. The fragments recovered from the Cave of Horror were too damaged and too incomplete for conventional reading in many places. Letters had disappeared, edges had broken away, sections had been crushed over time, leaving the ink present, but the surface holding it damaged, folded, and torn in ways that made the original writing almost impossible to understand with the naked eye. For generations, scholars had relied on careful manual examination of ancient manuscripts, using magnifying tools and years of experience to identify letters and reconstruct missing sections. But these fragments presented a different challenge. The damage was too severe, and the amount of material was too large for traditional methods alone. The research team scanned each fragment under 3 different types of light: standard visible light, infrared, and ultraviolet. Each wavelength revealed different details hidden within the ancient parchment. Infrared imaging could expose ink that had faded until it was nearly invisible under normal conditions. Ultraviolet light could highlight surface changes, traces of writing, and marks left behind by the original scribe. When combined, the 3 scanning methods created a layered digital image that contained far more information than any single photograph could capture. The next stage involved advanced optical character recognition software trained specifically to analyze ancient Greek and Hebrew writing. This was essential because ancient manuscripts do not follow the predictable patterns of modern printed text. Ancient scribes had individual handwriting styles. The shape of letters changed between different regions, historical periods, and even between different writers working at the same time. Software designed for modern documents would struggle to interpret these variations. The system used by the researchers had been trained on thousands of examples of ancient scripts, allowing it to recognize patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. The artificial intelligence system did not simply identify individual letters. It examined larger patterns across the fragments. It analyzed the spacing between words, the way specific letters were formed, the texture of the ink, the color differences in the parchment, and even the physical evidence of how separate sheets had once been connected. By comparing all of these details at once, the AI could suggest which fragments belong to the same scroll, which manuscripts may have been created by the same workshop, and which sections were likely written by the same scribe. Work that could have taken historians years of detailed comparison could now be completed much faster, allowing researchers to examine thousands of connections that would have been nearly impossible to track manually. The process was not designed to search for a particular discovery. The researchers were trying to organize and understand what had already been found. Then the AI detected something unexpected, something that was not on anyone's list of possible discoveries: the emotion in the ink. Handwriting is not perfectly consistent, even across a single document. People write differently when they are tired, afraid, sick, under pressure, or working in calm conditions. These differences are usually so small that human readers do not consciously notice them. The AI noticed them. Across specific sections of the fragments recovered from the Cave of Horror, the AI detected patterns that its analysis identified as possible signs of physical or emotional stress in the scribe. These signs appeared in tiny details that would be almost impossible to recognize through ordinary examination. There were micro-tremors in the letter strokes, moments where the writing hand appeared to shake slightly, causing the lines to become uneven. Some letters were more jagged than the same scribe's letters in other parts of the text. Other areas showed ink that appeared thinner, suggesting inconsistent pressure on the writing tool, the kind of variation that can happen when a person's hand is trembling or exhausted. The AI also noticed changes in spacing and alignment. In certain sections, the words appeared less evenly arranged, suggesting that the writer's concentration may have been interrupted. The hand was still attempting to create careful, deliberate writing, but the physical condition of the person behind the writing was affecting the final result. These were not signs of laziness or poor skill. Careless writing has a different pattern. What appeared in these fragments was the work of someone who understood the importance of what they were creating, but was struggling against circumstances beyond their control. The analysis suggested that some sections may have been written by people who were frightened, physically weakened, or both. The implications are difficult to ignore. These fragments were created around 135 CE, during one of the most devastating periods for the Jewish population living under Roman rule. The Bar Kokhba revolt ended in a crushing defeat. Thousands of communities were destroyed, countless people were killed, and many others were forced into exile or slavery. The region was experiencing violence and upheaval on a massive scale. The Temple in Jerusalem had already been destroyed decades earlier, and Jewish communities were fighting to preserve their identity, beliefs, and traditions. The person whose hand trembled while writing those words may have been living through that exact crisis. They may have known that the text they were copying or preserving could be one of the last remaining connections to their history and faith. At that point, the scrolls stop feeling like distant archaeological objects. They become evidence of a human moment. Someone sat down in the middle of fear, uncertainty, and destruction and continued writing anyway. The slight shaking of the ink, preserved for nearly 2,000 years, became more than a mark on parchment. It became a record of the person behind the words. Not one group. The most significant finding of the AI analysis was not about individual scribes. It was about the origin of the scrolls as a collection. The assumption that had organized Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship since the original discoveries in the 1940s was that the scrolls represented the library of a single community, most likely the Essenes, a Jewish sect that had withdrawn from mainstream society to live in the desert near Qumran. This single origin theory was not arbitrary. The geographic concentration of the original scroll discoveries around Qumran supported it, and the Essenes were a known group with a documented practice of communal living and scriptural study. The AI analysis of the 2021 fragments, combined with reanalysis of earlier material, complicated this picture substantially. The ink chemistry across different scrolls was not consistent with a single production source. Parchment textures varied in ways that reflected different animal sources and different preparation methods from different regions. Most tellingly, the handwriting analysis revealed scribal styles that were not variants of a single school or workshop, but were distinct enough to suggest training in entirely different scribal traditions associated with Jerusalem and Galilee, as well as the desert region around Qumran. The scrolls were not the product of one community. They were the product of many communities, connected by what they were doing rather than by where they lived. What they were doing was trying to preserve sacred texts during the period of crisis following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and continuing through the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE. Multiple groups of people in multiple locations across the region, copying and hiding texts in coordination with each other, trying to ensure that something would survive, even if they did not. The picture that replaces the Essene library model is a network, a coordinated, dispersed effort to protect what mattered most by scattering it across multiple hiding places so that no single discovery or disaster could destroy all of it. Some of what they hid was found in the 1940s. Some was found in 2021. Some may still be in caves that have not been reopened yet. What was left out? Among the most discussed findings to emerge from the AI analysis was not what the scrolls contained, but what they did not contain. Certain major books of the Hebrew Scriptures are entirely absent from the Dead Sea Scroll material, even accounting for the incomplete state of what has survived. The Book of Esther, the Book of Chronicles. These are not minor texts in the tradition. They are central books that appear in every known version of the Hebrew biblical canon. Their complete absence from the Dead Sea material has not been satisfactorily explained by conventional scholarship. The AI analysis also flagged passages in the recovered fragments that do not correspond to any version of those books in the known tradition. These passages mention figures and events that do not appear in the texts that have survived into the modern canon. They are not corruptions of known texts or misreadings of damaged passages. They are new content, text that someone included in their version of these books that does not exist in any other surviving source. More significant than the additions were the modifications. The AI detected systematic differences between the messianic passages in the Dead Sea material and the same passages in the texts that eventually became the fixed biblical canon. In the Qumran versions, messianic promises that appear in the canonical tradition as strong, direct, and unconditional are often toned down. The divine command becomes a statement of expectation. The absolute promise becomes a conditional hope. And in some cases, passages that in the canonical version describe a future divine intervention are rewrapped in the Dead Sea material with warnings about moral decay and calls for communal faithfulness, placing the emphasis not on what God will do, but on what the community must do first. The AI's conclusion, and the conclusion of the scholars working with its output, was that these differences were not random variation or copying errors. They were patterned. They were consistent. They reflected deliberate decisions made by specific scribal communities about how to present specific theological ideas. Different groups had different versions of the same texts because different groups were making choices about what those texts should say and emphasize. The text was never fixed. The finding that has generated the most discussion and the most discomfort among people whose faith rests on the idea of a stable and unchanging biblical text is the conclusion that follows directly from all of the above. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that the biblical text was not fixed during the period when the earliest surviving manuscripts were made. It was fluid. Different communities had different versions of the same books. Those versions differed in ways that were sometimes minor and sometimes significant. The differences were not accidents or corruptions that crept in through careless copying. They were choices made by people with stakes in how the texts read. reflecting the theological and political concerns of their communities and their moment. This is not a discovery that originated with the 2021 findings or with AI analysis. Scroll scholars have known since the 1940s that the Qumran texts did not perfectly match the later standardized versions of the Hebrew scriptures. What the AI analysis added was scale and specificity. By processing the full dataset across fragments from multiple excavations simultaneously, and by detecting patterns of variation that manual comparison had missed or underweighted, the AI produced a much clearer picture of how systematic and intentional the variations were. The question this raises is one that scholarship handles carefully and that believers often find uncomfortable. If the texts were being shaped by human choices during the period when they were being written and copied, who made those choices? And on what basis were some versions preserved and others lost? The Council of Jamnia around 90 CE is the standard answer for the Hebrew biblical canon, the meeting of rabbinical authorities who established which books belonged to the tradition following the destruction of the temple. The early Christian councils of the 4th century performed a similar function for what became the New Testament. These were decisions made by specific people in specific historical circumstances with specific concerns and specific blind spots. What the Dead Sea Scrolls show, and what the AI analysis makes more precise, is that the texts that arrived at those councils were themselves already the product of a long process of copying, editing, emphasizing, and sometimes deliberately revising. The councils fixed what had already been in motion for centuries. What the scribes were doing. Understanding what the scribes who made these scrolls were actually doing requires setting aside the mental image of ancient people carefully preserving unchanging sacred texts and replacing it with something more complicated and more human. These were people in crisis. Their temple had been destroyed. Their communities were being killed or scattered. The religious and cultural framework that their entire identity rested on was under direct physical attack. They were writing in caves and hiding manuscripts in rock crevices and dying of thirst surrounded by Roman soldiers. And in the middle of all of this, they were making choices about how to present the texts that were the core of what they believed. Some of those choices were conservative, aimed at preserving the texts exactly as they had received them, protecting the tradition against the chaos of the moment. Some of those choices were adaptive, adjusting the text to address the specific crises and questions of the present, making the ancient words speak to the immediate situation. Some of those choices were theological, reflecting genuine differences of opinion within the Jewish world of that period about what the texts meant, what they promised, and what they demanded. The AI detected all of these categories of choice in the patterns it identified across the fragments. And by detecting them as patterns rather than as individual anomalies, it made visible something that conventional scholarship had seen in pieces but had not fully assembled into a coherent picture. The Bible as it exists today is the surviving result of a process, not the untouched product of a single divine transmission. This does not make the texts less meaningful. For many readers, it makes them more meaningful. A text that was shaped by people living through genuine catastrophe, making genuine choices about what mattered enough to preserve, written in some cases by hands that were trembling with fear or illness, is a text that carries something the word sacred does not fully capture on its own. It carries the weight of human struggle. It carries the record of people who believed something so strongly that they died rather than let it disappear. The Cave of Horror got its name from the skeletons on the floor. It might equally have gotten its name from what it tells us about the conditions under which the texts we call sacred were made and kept. Not in calm scriptoriums by peaceful scholars, in hiding places, under siege, with trembling hands, by people who had no guarantee that what they were writing would ever be read. What this means. The AI analysis of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments does not destroy the foundation of any faith tradition. That is important to say clearly. because the finding is often framed in terms of what it undermines rather than what it reveals. What it reveals is considerably more interesting than what it undermines. It reveals a community of people who cared so much about their texts that they died for them. It reveals scribes who worked under conditions of extreme fear with enough precision that an AI 2,000 years later can detect the tremor in their handwriting. It reveals a network of communities that cooperated across geographic distance to preserve what they considered essential, with enough organizational sophistication that the preservation plan worked well enough for pieces of it to survive into the 21st century. It reveals that the texts were understood even by the people making them, as living documents responding to living circumstances rather than as frozen records immune to the concerns of the present. The question the scrolls raise, which the AI analysis makes more specific and more pressing, is the question of what it means for a text to be sacred. If sacred means untouched, unchanging, dropped from heaven in final form and preserved without human intervention, then the Dead Sea Scrolls challenge that definition directly, and the AI analysis makes the challenge harder to look away from. If sacred means something made by people who believed it was connected to something larger than themselves, who shaped it carefully and preserved it desperately, and died rather than let it disappear, then the scrolls do not challenge that definition at all. They illustrate it. The people in the Cave of Horror brought texts into that cave and hid them in crevices while they were dying. They did not know that anyone would ever find them. They were not preserving them for future scholarship, or for AI analysis, or for any certain audience. They were preserving them because the texts mattered enough to preserve even when there was no practical reason to believe that preservation would accomplish anything. The AI found their trembling in the ink. The trembling is the point. Faith is not a fixed thing handed down without cost. It is something people fought to keep alive in conditions where keeping anything alive was far from guaranteed. The scrolls are the record of that fight. 80 fragments in a cave where 40 people died waiting, trembling in 2,000-year-old ink. A network of scribes across Jerusalem and Galilee making choices about what to preserve and how. Texts that were never fixed, shaped by fear and faith in equal measure. AI found what human eyes missed. The scrolls are not a challenge to belief. They are its most honest record. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next.